Good afternoon, everybody, and nice to see you all on the live stream. We're here in Glasgow, live from COP26, but the speakers and you at home are all over the world, which is fantastic. And this is a Bright Blue and Water UK event, and we're exploring the question, in competition or collaboration, nature and net zero. And actually throughout our Fringe programme, and we're nearing the end of our Fringe programme here in Glasgow, a big debate that's come up is, yes, the sort of twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. Often the solutions go hand in hand, but sometimes they may be in conflict. And we want to explore that relationship. How can restoring nature, protecting nature, help the climate? And how can measures to protect the climate, reduce emissions, adapt to a new world of climate, how can that aid nature and rather than undermine it? So we'll be exploring this issue in this discussion today. For those of you who don't know Bright Blue, we're an independent think tank for liberal conservatism. Our mission really is to defend and improve liberal society. One of our major research themes is around energy and environment policy. And for the last 7 years that we've been in existence, we've had quite a lot of influence on government policy and public discourse, not least, for example, the push to have net zero targets. We published a report called Hotting Up a couple of years ago, where we said, look, there was a strong scientific, technological, political basis for adopting a net zero 2050 target. And it's good to see here at COP26, many more countries signing up to that net zero pledge. Of course, the real issue now is on delivery and particularly decarbonising in sectors which have been traditionally very hard to do. If you're on Twitter, please let's amplify the conversation, the arguments coming from today's session. You can use the hashtag #BrightBlue and hashtag COP26. Also, our Twitter handle is @WeAreBrightBlue, and the Twitter handle for Water UK, our partner, is Water UK. You, the audience, will have the opportunity to ask questions through Slido. There is a link below the screen that you are watching on YouTube. So please do click on that link and ask your question. Please do tell us who you are and where you're from. It's always nice to have a name to a question rather than just being anonymous. So some of the questions we're going to be exploring in this debate today are: is there too much emphasis being placed on technology-based rather than nature-based solutions to mitigate and adapt to climate change? Do technology-based solutions to climate change always have a negative impact on biodiversity? What are the key strengths and limitations of nature-based solutions to climate change? Should solutions to climate change which have a negative impact on nature simply be ignored? Which technology and nature-based solutions have had the best economic and ecological value? What role can and does UK water play in both worsening and mitigating climate change? And will the upscaling of hydrogen production in the UK, which the UK government is now firmly behind, exacerbate stresses to the water supply? So lots of questions there, looking at that relationship between nature and net zero and how we tackle these interrelated crises of climate change and biodiversity decline. We've got a brilliant panel with us to discuss all of this. Tony Juniper, who's the chair of Natural England, Kellyanne Naylor, who is the vice chair of UN Water, Mike Thompson, who's the chief economist and director of analysis at the Climate Change Committee here in the UK, Tawny Holmgren, who is the executive director of the Stockholm International Water Institute, Ronan Palmer, who's the associate director of clean economy at E3G, Professor Tom Stevenson, who is professor of water sciences at Cranfield University, and Christine McGaughty, who's the chief executive of Water UK. So a big panel there, and a very diverse panel as well, with people from different backgrounds and also from different places in the world, which is a theme that we've tried to do across all of our events here at COP26. So each speaker will give 5 minutes and then we'll open it up to questions. So Tony, who is in his shed, is up first. Over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Ryan, and good afternoon, everybody, or morning or evening, depending on where you are. in the world. This is a very welcome conversation to engage with, because I think for too long we have been regarding these twin crises of climate change and nature decline as separate. And I think this is really symptomatic of one of the gravest challenges we face in the pursuit of sustainable development, is how we tend in our minds and in organizations and in institutions to organize our work in silos. And it's really remarkable how over the years, these two twin crises, and they're twin in the sense of them being very closely related to one another and having a common origin, these twin challenges have been seen as separate, as witness two separate global treaty processes on climate change and on biodiversity, which go back to the Rio Earth Summit, and which have, until quite recently, been seen as two separate discussions. And of course, people have attempted to make the connections between the two over the years, but only very recently have we seen breakthroughs where now a truly joined up approach rather than a siloed approach is becoming apparent. And COP26, I was up there last week. I was delighted on Nature Day in particular to see this realization that if we don't solve both of these things together, we can't solve either of them separately. So we can't stop the mass extinction of animals and plants and ecosystem degradation without rapidly limiting global warming. And there is no pathway to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees without halting and reversing the destruction of nature. And so these combined problems have to be seen in combined strategies that lead to solutions. And there are really three headings, I think, that you can foresee whereby you'd organize that response. So one is mitigation of carbon. So we need to protect and restore high carbon ecosystems, peatlands, forests, salt marshes, seagrasses, mangroves, and so on. If we can conserve what's left and restore a lot of what's gone, we can remove carbon from the atmosphere and hold it in those ecological assets. At the same time, we need to adapt to climate change. No matter what we do, there's now going to be a level of adaptation required. And again, the conservation and restoration of coastal ecosystems can combat some of the effects of sea level rise, and the restoration of ecosystems on land can help to reduce the effects of, for example, flooding, more naturalized floodplains, protection of wetlands, protection of peatlands. All of these things can help to mitigate the effects of extreme weather and other changes that will take place. And then the third thing we need to do in seeing the synergies between nature and climate is to restore nature in ways that are going to lead to the ability of the natural world to be able to cope with the changes that are coming. So connectivity of ecosystems, joining up at landscape scale, fragmented areas of wildlife rich habitat so that nature can move through the landscape. Now, the good news is that you can combine all three of these things very often in the same place, and you can create the conditions whereby carbon is being held and captured at the same time as water is being held back in the environment, at the same time as restoring ecosystems at scale. And one of the things that we're doing here in England right now is to focus on the conservation of our peatland habitats. And these are a really good example of where you can do all of those things at the same time in the same place and bring other benefits too, in terms of clean water, which then aids fish populations, which then aids tourism potential in those landscapes. People come there and stay in hotels because they're going fishing in these carbon rich and beautiful, resilient landscapes. And of course, a public health and well-being benefit by creating those wilderness areas and those wildlife rich areas, especially when you can do it near to cities. And this is really the thinking behind the big idea that we have at Natural England, being the government's advisory body on the natural environment here, is to take this idea of integrated thinking to combine different areas of concern, climate change and nature decline at the top of that, but then to be putting them alongside what we need to be doing for public health and well-being and for the water environment, and coming up with intelligent ways that integrate lots of different benefits at once. And the way we will do that is through the creation of what we call a nature recovery network. And this is about building partnerships at landscape scale and using the different policy tools and funding sources that we have to be able to bring those partners to act together to do that job of nature restoration for all of those reasons. So we're very excited about this silo breaking set of ideas that are coming forward, which are visible there at COP26. And hopefully in the years ahead, the legacy of that meeting in Glasgow will be much more integrated thinking to solve these problems together rather than seeing them as separate. Thanks, Ryan.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you, Tony. And a sort of chance for me to plug a previous Bright Blue report, which was called Global Green Giant. And we really took that theme of, tackling these twin interrelated crises of biodiversity decline and climate. So please do look out for that 2020 report. And there's lots of policy ideas on how we can strengthen marine protection, tackle the illegal wildlife trade, reduce plastic pollution, and improve land use. And we thought that was particularly important in advance of COP26, but also COP15, which we know will now be happening in 2022 in China. One question I did have for you, Tony, is really you've spoken a lot about the kind of synergies between the nature and climate agendas, but sometimes we know they're in competition. So, for example, EVs. We desperately need people to take up electric vehicles. We need that electrification away from ICE vehicles. But we know sometimes the parts for those EVs can be quite damaging. The extraction of those parts can be quite damaging for the natural environment. Another example, bioenergy. We know that has helped quite a lot with the shift away from coal. But we know that means extracting natural resources, depleting natural resources, for example, in forests in North America. So when there is that sort of tension, what takes priority, climate or nature, or can it be resolved in some way?
Well, I think, Ryan, the tension is deeper. It's not necessarily a tension between low carbon and nature. It's a tension between human needs and nature. Because if you look at what's going on at the moment with the extraction of coal mines underneath rainforests and oil spills destroying seabird colonies, the existing system of energy and meeting human needs in relation to that is already in tension with the natural world. And so it's not as if we're entering a space where we're going to be, in a novel situation in the sense of, nature being the victim of how we meet the desire for humans to have mobility and, warm homes and everything else. And as was the case in the past, when we were extracting fossil fuels and still are, in the new world of low carbon, it's going to be about how we intelligently do that task of meeting needs with minimal damage to the environment and, where possible, restorative action for the environment. And actually, one of the phrases that I like to conjure with is the idea of going low carbon and high nature at the same time. And so, for example, can we make the extractive industries that will be looking for lithium and cobalt and copper and greater supplies of that, can those industries be equipped with a policy of net positive, whereby mining activities are linked to ecological restoration in the places where they're doing the mining and leading to a net benefit as a result of those industries being in existence? And so these are the kinds of policies that I think the low carbon sectors should be looking at. And in the UK context, we're having conversations with the offshore wind industry about how they can contribute to overall improvements in fish and seabird populations as a result of their industry generating more clean power. But you're right to raise the question, because it has been there. And, the relative profile of climate change during recent decades, it's taken off. It's become the dominant part of the environmental discussion. And years ago, I did have ministers say to me when I was working at Friends of the Earth, if you want this low carbon stuff, you're going to have to accept the ecological damage that will come with things like tidal barrages. And so, it did enter the mindset, and for good reason at one level, in the sense of, this is so urgent, it is so pressing, the consequences are so disastrous that we have to, look for the trade-offs and embrace them and own them. But I don't think that's the right way of looking at it. I think we have to find sweet spots and find policy tools and business models and strategies that will enable us to go nature positive at the same time as low carbon, rather than seeing this as a trade-off whereby one is sacrificed for the other. And there's every good scientific reason to know that is the right approach, rather than saying that, you know, low carbon is so important, we have to accept extinction as a consequence of the solutions that we need to adopt for it. So I think it's a mindset thing. You know, having said all of that, there will be places where it is extremely difficult and it will be challenging. But I think if we open the discussion with the idea that both have to be achieved together, I think then we can start to invent measures and strategies to be able to do that. But the mentality of trade-off, I fear, is still there in places.
Great. So yes, the low carbon and high nature mindset. Great stuff. Let's move now on to Kellyanne.
Great, Ryan. Thanks so much for inviting UN Water to be a part of this event. And just for those of you who have never heard of UN Water and said, what is this? I think just to say UN Water is the United Nations Interagency Coordination Mechanism for Water and Sanitation Issues. And we bring together 33 different UN entity members, 43 partner organizations to really help the member states of the UN to look at sustainably managing water and sanitation. And this is really the way that the UN system tries to speak with one voice on water and sanitation issues. And I think really building on, Tony's remarks, really looking at the climate crisis, the environmental crisis, and the water sector. We're of course talking about the global water crisis and how so many changes in water and changes in climate and the environment are really felt through water. And so just, one of the things that we wanted to share that we are kind of working on with this has been monitoring the global situation, particularly of the targets related to Sustainable Development Goal 6. And UN Water has an integrated monitoring initiative for SDG 6, and we produced at the beginning of this year an update on where we are as a world community on these water-related targets, really to have kind of better intelligence to guide our efforts. And I think, you always have to look at some good news. And I think, in this good news, we have seen some progress, particularly in reaching people with access to water and sanitation services. And we've also seen some encouraging progress in the data space to have more data available on fresh water, as well as countries investing in governance and water laws and institutions. But I think overall, we're still a bit overwhelmed by how off track we are. And this kind of coming at a time when we're about a third of the way, into the 2030 agenda. And while it's not a criticism, I think we always have to recognize the rates of progress. And I think, we can see this on the human side, looking at 2 billion people still lacking access to safely managed drinking water, or 3.6 billion people who still live without safely managed sanitation. But we can also look at it on the environment side, where we've mapped out that 56% of household wastewater is released and is treated, which of course means that 44% isn't and is released untreated into the environment. We've mapped out that 4 billion people live in water-stressed countries, and that 1/5 of the world's river basins have experienced rapid increases in their surface water area, which is indicative of flooding, a growth in reservoirs with newly inundated land, and we're seeing rapid declines in surface water areas, indicating drying up of lakes, reservoirs, wetlands, floodplains, and seasonal water bodies. So with that said, we have looked at how is it that we're going to be able to accelerate progress so that we can really be linking sustainable development with being able to respond to climate change, to reduce the risk of disasters, many of which are water related, but also use these water resources more effectively. And to do that, we've put together an acceleration framework, which really outlines 5 areas that can be used for acceleration: financing, data and information, capacity development, innovation, and governance. But Ryan, coming to your question, and one that's a topic of this session around whether or not we see that there's too much evidence being placed focused on technology-based solutions rather than nature-based solutions to mitigate and adapt to climate change. I think we would say in the water space that these are certainly not in competition, and that both types of solutions are needed. And I think one area where we think there's great promise is specifically in the area of innovations that can be, I think, both an accelerator, but also ways of bringing new solutions and better value propositions that can break some of these silos. And, you know, a few areas where we thought that we could that innovative practices would be very helpful in order to leverage and scale improved water resources and sanitation solutions are really, one would be a focus on scaling up best practices. I think we're seeing a lot of innovations, but what we would really like to see is that these innovations are able to get into the hands of those who need them, and that we can bring resources behind it. The second area where we've been trying to kind of support innovation as the UN system is in building international standards. And we think that these can be really helpful for bringing, being able to have a more favorable enabling environment for technology-based solutions for sustainable development in SDG 6. So this is another area, and I think, you know, we're seeing this with water sensing, early warning systems, but also looking for identifying some of those disruptive technologies that can help with more smart water management. And just I think the last point, and one, of course, that's always great for these types of forums, is looking at the fact that we all have a role in bringing this to bear. And I think one thing I wanted to really invite everyone who's here to be able to contribute your efforts into the SDG 6 action space. I think we're really trying to use this SDG action space as a way to be able to see the great work being done in the sector, to provide this as an opportunity for exchange and learning, but also really to take stock of our progress leading up to this important 2023 UN Conference on Water that's going to be taking place in New York, where we hope to be able to bring together the climate action conventions, the biodiversity and environment conventions, together with our global commitments on water. So thanks, Ryan, and yeah, hope that answers the question, and back over to you.
Thanks so much, Kellyanne, and great to hear about the UN conference, water conference in 2023. I suppose the question for me is, obviously we're nearing the end of COP26 here in Glasgow, and just from your perspective, you know, how are things looking? Have leaders come together and done the necessary action, not only on climate, but on water and on sustainability and biodiversity? I mean, what's your sort of view at the moment of where things are at COP26?
Great, Ryan, thanks for that. I think while we're all still, you know, still digesting, I think I spent a lot of the week in the water pavilion, and I'm certain that Torgny will also, you know, really have a lot to offer in the space. I think one thing that we've seen is, I think we have seen an exciting presence of water being part of the agenda. I think one of our feeling as the water community coming to COP was that the adaptation agenda provides a lot of opportunities for water, environment, and biodiversity to be a much more central part of the conversation. And I think we've heard, certainly from the leaders, especially coming from Africa and the least developed countries, that there is going to really need to be an effort to kind of double down on developing the national adaptation plans. And I think that this can be a great opportunity for us to be coming up with these you know, solutions that are really addressing, you know, these multiple, you know, planetary and human crises that we've been looking at. And I think also in my my day job, I work in UNICEF. So I think the other message we've kind of heard loud and clear is the engagement of young people. And I think as a water community, we really also want to be part of the solution that the young climate activists and governments really are encouraging us to move faster on. So those are a few things I think we're really thinking about, is how between now and the next COP we can try to make progress on those adaptation plans. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you, Kellyanne, for that. Okay, so we'll now move to Mike from the CCC, and I suppose really in your kind of modelling around a kind of trajectory to net zero, what's the role of nature in that? And when we move towards net zero as well, will nature or the natural environment, some parts of the natural environment, have to be sacrificed? Interested in your thoughts on that, Mike.
Great, thank you, Ryan, and hello everyone. A pleasure to be here as well. I'm still in Glasgow, so I've hightailed it back to my room for this. But yeah, a joy to join you all here today as well. I mean, if I just take the big picture question first, you know, is it in collaboration or in competition? Well, we know what's terrible for nature, climate change, and we know something that's terrible for climate change is nature loss. So at the big picture level, of course, these two things have to go together. Of course, it has to be a collaboration. They are fundamentally, tackling those two issues is fundamentally helping the other one as well. You're right, Ryan. My job, I guess, at the CCC is to paint these scenarios, to paint these paths for how we reduce emissions, how we deliver on the targets that we need to hit in terms of the reductions in emissions to 2030 and then on to 2050. And they have a lot of technology in it, no hiding from that, and they have a lot of nature in it as well. We need to use all the tools in the box. We need to use all the solutions at our fingertips, certainly, to get there. And if we kind of step through some of those options that we use, well, generally, actually, they do tend to support each other, we think. So if we think of the big picture here, and I guess the really big thing is getting rid of fossil fuels, getting away from fossil fuels in the system. We'll see if that survives in the Glasgow text through the next couple of days. If you're worried about the lithium supply chain, Ryan, I've got some bad news to you about the fossil fuel supply chains, because, of course, getting out of fossil fuels means less extraction, it means less mining, it means less moving it around, it means less risk of spillage, it means better air quality when we're not burning it, it means less noise pollution on the street. So lots of things that are fundamentally positive for nature. And so I guess, again, that big picture, these things join up pretty well. And you can kind of go through all the specific things in the program. Energy efficiency, of course, fundamentally using less resources. Getting back to that issue, as Tony says, there is a consumption problem, which is a problem for both climate and for nature. And so reducing our reliance on energy, reducing our wastage of energy is positive all round. If we go then into kind of where the two start to join up more directly, I guess, in agriculture, lots of the things that we need to do are about reducing nitrous oxide release. And generally, that's about reducing excess application of fertilizer. That brings you a climate benefit, but it will also bring you, of course, water quality, air quality benefits as you reduce the risks of leakage as well. In land, fundamentally, it is about moving carbon from the atmosphere into biomass and into living things. So trees, primarily, I guess, we're normally thinking about there. If those are the right types of trees in the right places, of course, that brings you a real opportunity for better ecosystem services, better habitat provision, and positive responses for nature. The really big one, I think, where there's a real overlap is meat consumption. All of our scenarios to hit the UK targets involve a reduction in meat consumption, reduction in livestock production, both meat and dairy, 20% by 2035 onto 35% reduction by 2050. And that, of course, releases a huge amount of land that you can use for nature, land that you can use for carbon sequestration. So that, I think, is a big one that at the moment is a bit missing from some of the plans in the UK, actually, and clearly is an opportunity to do both. I think when we come on to when are net zero and nature in competition, I think it's a relatively narrow set of things that we're talking about. And fundamentally, it comes down to not doing really stupid things, actually, to not being daft in our solution. So it means not cutting down standing forests for biomass. It means not planting trees on peatland or on wildflower meadows. And it means things like making sure you put nuclear plants, say, by the coast instead of using fresh water for cooling. It means limiting your use of carbon capture and storage to use where you need it, not instead of, for example, renewables, which have a much lower water footprint and lower emissions attached to them. So I think really it is about not doing daft things, and biomass, of course, as you hinted at, is the big one, I think, there to get right. But I also think it's about getting the benefits that are there for collaboration, so not missing out on the opportunities to join these things up. We're going to have a huge tree planting program in the UK. We have to have in order to meet the targets. And you can do that in a nature positive way, or you can do it in a way where you don't reap all the benefits for that. Now, we've always included 2/3 of the planting as broadleaf forests, for example, rather than just conifers. That kind of decision makes a huge difference in terms of the benefit for nature, and of course, where you put those forests, where you put those trees, absolutely vital. Bioenergy production, I think, is one where there is a question there, which is how do we do that in a more nature positive way? I think that is a rich vein for better research, better understanding, better policy, particularly to make sure that the bioenergy production that we will need, there are no scenarios that meet the global objectives, that meet the UK objectives without more bioenergy production. How do we do that in a way that helps nature? And on the diet one, I think the public perception angle of it, the public choice angle, I think is a really important one, because actually, if you tell people that eating less meat is good for their health, that's one thing. If you tell them that it's good for the environment and for nature, that's one thing. If you tell them that it's good for climate, that's one thing. And individually, they never quite seem to be enough to convince people to change. But actually, maybe if we can increasingly bring the three together and say, look, choosing to eat less meat, it's positive for your health, it's positive for the climate, it's positive for nature. The combined effect of those potentially can be the thing that really gets us to the kind of changes that we need to see. So overall, I think the message is, look, we have to do these things together. Completely agree with everything Tony has said, that we have to join up. We have to join up now. We've got to get ahead of this, because there is a very big program that is being developed very rapidly to deliver on the climate targets, and it has to be, because we are so late into the journey on net zero. That speed, that focus does bring a risk with it that we forget about everything else, and it is net zero, blinkers on, forget the rest of it, and that would be a tragic missed opportunity, and it would bring, of course, some risks with it. So I think we have to take the blinkers off, we have to think holistically, and we have to start joining these things up now. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mike. So you talked about meat consumption and reducing that, and the need to do that to meet the sort of carbon pathways that you're talking about. Trying to convince the public on reducing meat consumption. You've talked about the different arguments, but might we need to do more in terms of policy than just kind of informational, educational campaigns? You know, might we need to be thinking about meat taxes, for example, or, you know, does the CCC think about new policies that might be needed to kind of nudge consumers away from meat even more? Yeah,
I think I'm very wary of meat taxes, and I think I tend to align with Henry Dimbleby's national food strategy here, that you don't necessarily need a meat tax to deliver this. We've got a public out there that have shown they are very concerned about climate change, that say they want to do something about climate change. And I think actually enabling them, informing them, giving them the power to make the right decisions, I think is a really, can actually probably get us quite a long way. We already see a downward trend in terms of meat eating. We of course have new products coming to the market, meat substitutes, that market is growing. So I think we are at a place where there is a potential to really make a difference. The striking thing here at the COP venue is that every catering facility that you have has got a little label up next to all of the options that you can choose on the board that tells you how many kilograms of CO2 are attached to your meal. So you go to the burger bar and you can see 0.2 kilograms of CO2 in the bean burger, 0.9 kilograms in the chicken burger, and 3.3 in the beef burger. I think these are the sort of things that in the public consciousness, they're not well enough understood. And I think really clear information with a public which is willing to change and looking actually to make changes, I think is an opportunity to do it.
Great. So not just calorie counts on your food, but climate counts as well.
Carbon counts, yeah.
Great. So let's move now to Tawny, who's also in Glasgow, I think, or was in Glasgow.
Thanks. Yes, I just returned a few days ago from having spent more than a week in Glasgow, and that was a great experience. And thank you so much for organizing this important event. And on Glasgow, I will tell that when we opened up the water pavilion last Monday, or the Monday week before, I mentioned that it took us 12 years from Copenhagen to Glasgow to get water recognized as part of the main agenda discussion at the climate change conference. And it has taken a number of years, 12 years, but also that we have official water days, etc. But I think what I brought with me from Glasgow is that now we are speaking about nature-based solutions, the impact of water, not only for adaptation, but also for mitigation. And that is also something I would like to elaborate on in my intervention here, that building on the most recent IPCC report from August this year, it strongly speaks about how global warming is getting more and more dangerous and more floods and droughts in the future. And at COP last week, I was in a session with WMO mentioning that, droughts will be the new pandemic of the world. We could only expect more droughts and flooding in the years to come. And that brings me also to have two main actions that it must start on from the water lens. First, there are a broad range of water-related climate solutions that are not used to their full potential. And I think here we have, even if it's not a low fruit, we have something really to take on. And many of these nature-based solutions that can help to address we can address more than one problem at one go. For example, by restoring wetlands, as we know, and watersheds, we get powerful water sinks, or carbon sinks, I mean, of course, but also lower the risk of flooding, droughts, and water shortages. And that is something that myself and Johan Rockström from Potsdam Institute raised last week in a daily op-ed here in Stockholm, Sweden, based on some research that we are undertaking together with UNDP and colleagues in Germany, and also the Potsdam Institute. So far, oceans, wetlands, and forests have been able to absorb more or less half of the greenhouse gases emitted. But those calculations and projections are based on the assumption that nature's ability to store carbon will remain intact. But we see now some dangerous signs that might not be the case in the future, that we might go from carbon sinks to carbon emitters. And that gives me a lot of concern. So it's so crucial to restore and protect ecosystems so that they maintain the ability to restore, to sequester and store carbon, and do not shift to be kind of carbon emitters. At the same time, on one of your questions, I can come back to that later, is about is this trade-off between nature-based solutions and also behavior change, and should it substitute for emission cuts and technological innovation? I don't think so. I think we need all of these. And my point is that the role of nature has too often been forgotten, and that is a major obstacle to effective address climate action. And if I look at finance, at least some figures I've got is that only some 3% of climate action funding is going to nature-based solutions. And that is far too small. Of course, given also what we might face in the future, that going from carbon sinks to carbon emitters. My other reasons that is why all climate policy must start at least address the water issue, that in the next few years, most, if not all sectors of our society will undergo major transformations to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And all these transformations will impact or be impacted by water. But we do often forget when we plan for new food systems, greener energy, be there cleaner transport, and also in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the effects that water plays in this in these circumstances. Often all these measures or actions are taken for granted, more or less, an uninterrupted access to water in great quantities, which will be increasingly difficult in many parts of the world regions due to global warming. And access to water is one of the major challenges we do face in the world in the future. Growing population, developing economies, etc. But water is a finite resource. So in the end, to transition to green energy, resilient food systems, and also more resilient societies, we need to improve how we manage water it is as simple as that. Countries need to become more aware of the solutions that do exist, and they do exist. But we also need more research on this, and we are right now, I mentioned, conducting some research together with the Potsdam Institute and GIZ and UNDP on this, the role that water can play also in climate mitigation that maybe was not discussed or even thought of before. One colleague of mine have looked into the NDCs also recently, and the national determined contributions, as we know, and the first generation we know to a large extent, at least for low-income countries, they have water in it. But now I think what we learned from the recent generation of NDCs that they also refer much more to nature-based solutions, which was harder the case before. I think that is a good sign of the role that NBS would play in the future. I often quote Inger Andersen, the head of UNEP. I think she's coined the expression, at least she has used it a number of times. We need a new compact with nature. I think that is for sure for the future. To summarize, let us focus more on the role of nature. I think we all agree on that, but also we need also to carefully assess the water impacts of climate decisions. And I think that is still not maybe under the radar, but to a large extent forgotten, because without water, we cannot solve this climate crisis. By rethinking our relationship with water and nature, we could be entering a new era of opportunity. I think there are a lot of potential addressing NBS and also bringing in the water aspects in that. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Tony. And just to remind people, if you're watching from home, that you can ask questions through Slido, and the link is below your video on your YouTube channel. And just press on that link, ask your question, tell us who you are and where you're from. And I'll be receiving those questions. So I will be looking at my phone. So it isn't my wife texting me and me replying to that. It is me looking at your questions. So Ronan, over to you.
Ryan, thanks very much, and thanks to everyone for just being here and enabling us to have this discussion. I'm from E3G, we're a climate change think tank, but I suppose I have to admit my personal background is very much across both energy and water. So I've come into E3G with, if you like, some climate and some biodiversity, both in my heart and in my mind. So it's very much part of the way I think is how we can bring these back together. And I suppose the other thing about my role in E3G and therefore in bringing to COP and to climate change is, and I have to express this very carefully, we have done the easy bits, i.e. the incredible difficult job of moving it up the agenda, talking mitigation, making people realize the issues with fossil fuels and moving beyond fossil fuels. That's been a really tough job. And now we have to go into everybody's home and think about how the home is heated, and onto people's farms and talk about their livestock, and into people's lives across the world, how they live, and what moving to net zero means. And indeed, I would say, because we also do it, going into ministers of finance across the world and say what net zero means to them and what climate change means to them, because it is going to A, make their jobs a lot harder running their economies if they don't get a grip on climate change, and B, they are going to have to take very seriously how they manage the transition so that we can get there with everybody on board and nobody left behind. So in terms of the conversation we're having today, I don't personally see a conflict between climate and biodiversity. There will always be issues on the margins that we have to deal with. But in a sense, it was our choice, totally reasonably, to break the Earth Summit into its different strands in climate and biodiversity. It's just a management issue. We mustn't forget that that's all it is. We have to keep them interconnected all of the time. I really welcome what Kellyanne said about the UN bringing us back together, because after all, next year we are 30 years out of Rio. It is time we thought about how we invest for the whole Earth. Secondly, throughout COP, I have been seeing and hearing, not in person because I have stayed away from Glasgow, but I have been following it very closely and working very closely with what's happening on the ground. You do hear demands for natural solutions. They're part of the adaptation agenda. They're part of the calls from Indigenous communities as well. Very much communities that look after their water environment, that rely on their water environment and on their natural habitats. I would even go so far as to say if Kellyanne in UNICEF is working on natural solutions as part of an agenda for young people, she might phone up our colleagues in UNESCO, because there's definitely a cultural aspect to this across the world. But as Tony reminded us, if you take a look at any of the nature-based solutions that you might look at for adaptation, they tend to have immense mitigation benefits, and vice versa. The two are completely interconnected. Unfortunately, nobody has told biodiversity that they need to apply for two different jobs. They do both at the same time. So just three thoughts then to leave you with. So is there no competition at all, you say? Actually, there is immense competition sometimes, and it really makes me sad. And I have noticed it very much in terms of the recovery from COVID and the development needs, where I have seen people saying, oh, we need some money from the IMF for climate. And somebody else says, no, we don't need money for climate. We need money for nature-based solutions. And then you bring in a whole lot of other things that we need money for, like health, education and development. Increasingly, these things are so interconnected. And it's really important that we sit down and look at how the interconnection works and what the right, if you like, portfolio of development solutions we need. The second is, I think the interactions between how we think about water and how we think about land on the one hand, and climate change on the other, are going to become even more intricate when we get down into the world that Mike has talked about, when we start thinking about land use. This is why I say I think some of the toughest debates are still ahead. But actually, the more that we can think about how different uses of land, restoring old habitats, etc., or using land differently, can bring enormous benefits to people through climate mitigation, through tourism, through just having a better, a richer environment, then it's in that context that I would like to say, and now can we talk about livestock? Now can we talk about agriculture? But above all, we are so close to the end of COP, and I can't leave this without talking about what I see as a desperate lack of urgency about this. I am deeply disappointed at this stage that world leaders, despite some great speeches last week, are not yet mobilizing with the urgency that they need to address this, that it takes money, it takes action by governments. Yes, there's plenty of private sector money that can move in, but governments need to take action. And that's why I really applaud those people who are looking seriously at how we can think again about global payments for public goods, debt and nature swaps, debt and climate swaps. These could all be really, really important. But without the urgency, we're not going to sort climate change, and we're certainly not going to sort biodiversity. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Ronan. And just picking up on your pessimism around COP26, I'm just wondering where you think the kind of main blockages are. What's the sort of main causes of the lack of progress that you want to see?
Last week, a colleague and I read a blog about New Hope or False Dawn, and I certainly had a lot of New Hope last week. I'm now fearing False Dawn may be coming. I think the blockages are that the parties coming together. They're talking a lot of really good words. You know, I think we really are close to seeing an end to coal. I think despite the problems with the deforestation pledge, it's good to see it coming up. It's been wonderful to see talk about loss and damage. Where's the money? last night, the Vulnerables Forum, they just talked about their intense disappointment that even the 100 billion for climate change that had been pledged is now 2 years late. And we all knew it's not enough. It was probably never enough, but now it's certainly not enough. That said, I still hang my hopes on some wonderful things that Prime Minister Motley of Barbados and Prime Minister, Council President Draghi of Italy said last week about this quantum leap, about seriously putting some money, some big fiscal space in that would allow the investments to be made. We are still not finished, COP, so I still have hope for that. But I promise you all that if we don't get it from COP, Monday morning, I'll be back up again, looking to see if we can overcome that barrier, that unwillingness of governments to really sit down and face up to the kind of economic scale of the task ahead.
Great, thank you, Ronan. So really getting the sort of pledging of finance from developed countries to developing countries, often they're on the front line of the climate crisis. And indeed, we had an event earlier with the Minister for the Environment from the Gambia, and he made an interesting point, which was it's not just about the pledging of finance. Even when the finance has been pledged, accessibility to it can be very difficult and take a very long time. It's very complicated. So I just wanted to throw that in as well, because that is something that some of the developing countries are also saying.
We talk a lot about platforms that would really make that move possible, a country platform. So let's say go to the Gambia, there might be a pledge. How do we very quickly wrap that up with the projects that Gambia will have, with maybe there will be on the ground changes that Gambia wants to make about how people are trained, about how they facilitate the supply chain for renewable projects or nature-based solutions that they would be doing. But how could we get that whole package together? Because it is no good phoning up the environment minister and saying, I've got 15 million for you over here. Come in next week and tell me how you want me to spend it, because that will not work. It's got to be much more cooperative and much more thought through.
Okay, Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. So let me introduce myself. My name's Tom Stevenson. As you heard from Ryan, I'm a professor of water sciences, so I will perhaps some of my comments are going to be a bit narrower around the water sector and nature-based solutions and climate. I don't have the global expertise of some of our previous speakers. So Cranfield is an exclusively postgraduate university, and we specialize in technology and management. So we're believers in that you need both to solve problems that, and we're interested in solving problems for industry, for governments, and for NGOs. I suppose I thought I'd come back to your first question, Ryan, about too much emphasis on tech-based rather than nature-based solutions. And I will agree, several people have already said that we're going to need both. And you know, I did read somewhere that in terms of emphasis that nature-based solutions are only going to provide us with about 20% of mitigation needed for 2 degrees by 2050. Now that's just one estimate. So whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but it's not going to be all of it. Maybe, it probably 50, 60% might be closer. If I'm to sort of take a rather sort of dull chemical engineers approach to it, we've spent sort of a couple of centuries on process intensification, taking captured carbon out of the earth and sticking it into the atmosphere. We need to have some reverse process intensification. A hectare of land has only so much capacity, and I think that some engineering solutions are going to have to go hand in hand with nature-based solutions. I might argue that some of the, in my own sector, wastewater treatment, we heard earlier from Kellyanne that there's still a huge amount of wastewater not treated. But in my own sector, engineers have harnessed nature, but they've intensified it and put it in concrete tanks. but it's nonetheless, it is nature. And it's bacteria, it's the microbiome that is working for us often. But what we need to do is, maybe is make sure that the energy sources are decarbonised, and that will have to be, that's going to be an important part of the solutions. I think certainly in wastewater treatment, and nature-based solutions have really come to the fore in the last 4 or 5 years for constructed wetlands for wastewater treatment. But you need to have the land for that. If I'm to sort of, I'm sorry folks, I'm going to sort of think a little narrowly, that if we were tried to have wetlands to treat all the wastewater from a city the size of London, say, do we have the land and the space to do that? It's the pollutant removal rate per square meter, per cubic meter. If you're not doing a little bit of heating, a little bit of putting some kind of energy in there, that's the point of it. So I think the technology-based solutions do not necessarily have to have a negative impact on biodiversity, because it depends how you put those technology solutions together. So an example might be, again, we're tending in most developed countries to use a lot of energy to use aerobic nature, which requires air, oxygen. If you were to use anaerobic technologies, actually you might be reducing pollution at the same time as providing renewable energy, and we need to be sort of smarter at the way we could do some of those things. And I think really that sort of comes back to sort of Tony right at the start talked about that we need to be limiting climate change. And he preceded that by saying rapidly limiting climate change. And I think that so some of the technological solutions are really going to have to work hand in hand with the nature-based solutions. I don't think there's going to be, for any industrial sector, a kind of get out of jail free card by saying we're planting lots of deciduous forests. We know that we've got, in the UK, for example, we've got horrendous problems with tree disease at the moment, and I'm sure others around this virtual table could tell me more about that than I will know. So as Tony said around the sort of capturing carbon, there also might be release. I think I just want to sort of, one of the questions I'm sure that Christine will come on to was around sort of hydrogen, and we heard Mike mentioned, Tony mentioned electric vehicles, and I think Mike mentioned it as well. I read somewhere recently where I suspect it was a motoring correspondent. I don't make a habit of reading car reviews, but you can't help it now and again, describing EVs as Betamax, and that hydrogen is going to be VHS. Maybe we need to be moving even beyond the VHS, and I think for the water sector, so I'll leave you with that thought. I think there's a little bit about nitrogen. I know there was, I think it's Professor Mark Sutton who sort of managed to get onto the BBC to talk about nitrogen, and I know that at COP that has come up. I think that's not been spoken about enough when it comes to climate change, and how we should be considering the nitrogen cycle, both the natural and the anthropogenic cycles, a little bit more in terms of mitigating climate. And I think there's great opportunities in the water sector for looking at looking at ammonia as energy storage, as an for if you like, working hand in hand with a hydrogen economy.
Great.
So we'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, no, very interesting, very detailed, and very informative. Thank you, Tom. We'll move now to Christine.
Thanks very much, Ryan. And these great discussions so far. And I'm going to touch on a few things that Torgny, Mike, and others have touched on. but I'll keep my comments relatively brief. I'm the Chief Executive of Water UK. That's the trade association representing the water companies. And of course, we're a sector that's completely rooted in nature, but we're also a sector that has historically relied on technology and pouring concrete as the go-to for operational processes. But that's just clearly not sustainable in a low carbon world, and things are changing pretty fast. In fact, it was almost a year ago exactly that the water companies in England spearheaded that low carbon journey by launching our net zero 2030 route map. And it was very ambitious, actually, the world's first detailed sector-wide plan to reach net zero by 2030. We didn't have all the answers, but that was the ambition. And we set out a range of possible pathways and interventions and their implications, and it's really galvanized the effort right across the industry. And that expresses precisely that desire to move away from the traditional concrete and steel to much more nature-based solutions, which Torgny and others have already talked about. And they bring co-benefits way beyond just net zero, but they are actually central to the successful delivery of our net zero target. They also have the benefit of bringing restoration of nature, increased resilience, and protecting the long-term security of our water resources and public water supply, and reducing flood risk. So a whole range of advantages. And we're really clear that mitigating climate change has to be embedded in the delivery of water and wastewater services that our sector provides to homes and businesses everywhere. And I'll just give a few examples of that. We've heard a little bit about them, but there are some examples that bring them to life. Peatland restoration is one. And the sector has actually committed to restoring 10,000 hectares of degraded peatland on water company land by 2013. And that will remove a huge amount of CO2 from the atmosphere. But we can and are going much further, working with wildlife trusts and lots of NGOs and local authorities. There's a huge amount going on there. One example being the work that United Utilities are doing in the Peak District. They're restoring bog vegetation there, and that's improving habitats and increasing the biodiversity of vegetation, contributing to water quality improvement, and helping retain more water on the moorland. And that in the long term helps with flood management. So a whole array of different opportunities. The second one that I'll touch on is just sustainable drainage systems, otherwise known as SUDs. I don't think anyone has touched on them so far, but they have a really important role to play. We know that they work, and they naturally store and slow surface water through things like permeable pavements, keeping water out of the sewage treatment process altogether, and they can keep water in areas of water stress, and that improves overall resilience. So then they have other benefits as well. They also create green spaces. They look good, people like them, and they cut emissions associated with unnecessary wastewater treatments. There's one really good example of that I have, which is what Welsh Water are doing in their greener Grangetown in Cardiff, and they're creating a number of green streets. And that's just one of many examples I could have picked. So they'll dramatically reduce the surface water runoff. It looks better, and it reduces the pumping and energy costs, as well as creating more room in the drainage infrastructure. So it helps the growth of the city. So again, loads of different benefits there. And the last one I was going to touch on was just seagrass. Someone else touched on that briefly already, but seagrass planting and restoration also has a really big role to play. We know that seagrass meadows enhance the stability of coastal zones. They lock carbon at a rapid rate, improve water quality in creating habitat. And a couple of our members, Affinity Water and Anglian, are doing a lot of work in this area with a blueprint for restoration of seagrass in the estuaries and coasts of Essex and Suffolk. I think that's through the Ofwat Innovation Fund. So there is a huge amount going on. And we believe, as I said before, that restoring nature is going to be absolutely key to the carbon ambitions of the sector. Someone touched on trees. The industry is also committed to planting 11 million trees by 2030. So Ronan talked a little bit about the need for urgency, and we completely agree. I'm sure everyone does on this panel. From our perspective, the water industry must absolutely invest now during this critical decade to increase resilience to what we know are going to be the very challenging impacts of climate change. So acting early, using the solutions that we've outlined in our route map will help us meet the twin challenges around net zero and enhancing nature. And there needn't be this competition between reducing emissions between nature and technology. We need both, and they can complement and should complement each other to work towards that decarbonisation goal. Of course, what we need is the space and the policy direction to make that happen. That's where policy and regulation are absolutely critical. They need to be right in order, those frameworks need to be right in order to enable the investment and enable the innovation that we all want to deliver these solutions that we've all talked about today. Thanks very much, Ryan.
Great, Christine, thank you for that, and some of the examples that you gave as well, which is very good to hear, some of the sort of more tangible, practical stuff that's happening. Right, let's open it up to questions now, because people have been waiting a long time to get their questions in. So lots are coming through from the live stream. So I have a question here from Jonathan Fisher, who is an environmental economist, who asks, how can we handle, especially in trade deals, increased greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture abroad, for example, in Australia, the US, Brazil, versus in the UK, especially based on regenerative farming? So question there. And then I've got another question from Jane, who asks, what are your thoughts on carbon credits? Should we be monetizing nature? So I might come to Mike, perhaps on that latter question first.
Great, thank you. I think we probably will need a form of carbon credits for the tree planting program. I think fundamentally, it doesn't necessarily have to be carbon credits. There could be other ways of doing it. But I think fundamentally, what we do need is money to flow into doing it, because we're trying to scale it up to such a level compared to what we've had before, that one of the challenges is funding to come in to pay for the land for it to go on, to pay for the trees to go on, to pay for the labour attached to it, and make sure that is an attractive and worthwhile thing. I think the really important thing, I guess, in this discussion is that we line up the different policy parts. So if there are funding streams coming in for the carbon sequestration element, whether that is carbon credits or maybe it's an auction system for sequestering carbon, that we line that up with payments for protecting biodiversity regulations to make sure that you can only access those streams if you are planting trees, sequestering carbon in a way that is nature positive. And we need to line those up in reality, in practice. They need to be lined up in terms of the timing at which you can access, the timing with which the different policies apply, the ease with which they do. We've got at the minute kind of twin tracks going on between the Environment Act, the Agriculture Bill, and the various mechanisms that are being developed, and potential for this to come into the UK ETS. So there's lots of different policy levers at the minute, and we need to make sure that those policy levers join up in a really practical sense, actually. So I think that we should see carbon credits for what they are, a source of funding to come in to pay for the measures to sequester carbon, but we have to have alongside them mechanisms that make sure that the actions that then happen are happening in a nature positive way.
Okay, Tony, did you want to come in any of those questions? You're on mute, so I don't know what you're saying.
Sorry, Ryan. Yeah, I mean, on the carbon credit side, I mean, we do need to recover nature and expand forest cover. Of course we do. And you know, there are ways in which we might be able to benefit from the resources being invested in that are linked to the decarbonisation agenda. But this needs to be done really carefully in order that we can avoid some of the potential dangers of pursuing the carbon piece at the expense of nature. You know, there have been some pretty shocking examples over the years of trees being put in the wrong places to catch carbon, but damaging other important wildlife habitats. And, you know, some of the worst examples of that involve planting trees on peatlands, you know, where you're releasing vast amounts of carbon, but counting that as a credit because you've planted some trees somewhere. So we need safeguards along those kinds of dimensions to avoid inadvertent downsides. The other bit of it is the extent to which, you know, there is going to be quite limited opportunity to be gaining carbon benefits from offsetting. You know, the amount of land in the world is actually, you know, it's finite, obviously, and there's a great deal of demand upon it for food, for housing, for infrastructure. And so there's a really important question about who's got the priority call on those carbon credits. And, you know, just being very clear about the extent to which this has to be linked with a decarbonisation agenda, which is, you know, looking to these kinds of credits as a last resort rather than upfront. And then, you know, having some kind of qualification, I guess, for people who can actually buy them. You know, you wouldn't expect people who've got, you know, clear alternatives like, you know, coal power stations to be able to buy those kinds of credits because they should be shifting into renewables. But there are other sectors that are hard to decarbonize. And you may say, actually, they should have some kind of prioritization. I don't take an ideological view against it. Some people do. I don't. But nonetheless, you're going to need some pretty rigorous safeguards if we're going to pursue this at scale, which people evidently want to do in some cases.
Excellent, thank you. Maybe Ronan, you might want to answer the question from Jonathan around agriculture.
I certainly will pick up Jonathan's question, but just to reflect briefly on carbon credits, it is ironic that we have learned a lot of how to run markets like this from that the godfather of all fossil fuels, the oil market. We know how big a barrel is. We can work out the specific gravity, and we can work out how much it takes to move a tanker load from the Gulf to the west of Europe. So actually, it makes much of this quite easy to calculate. Now let's try to do that for a bog in the west of Ireland or a hectare of the Amazon forest. It gets a lot more complicated. So I think we have to be somewhat careful in how this plays out. And the other, I would say, is that I would love to see credit being given for the things we can do in urban areas. And Christine mentioned SADs. There have to be two people here who mentioned SADs, Christine. It cannot only be mentioned by one person in a meeting. It should be a rule. But it is so important that we get the urban landscape working for us. I would think of this in terms of water, absolutely essential, but don't forget getting more water, more trees, more green into the urban landscape also helps cool the landscape, also helps reduce the heating needs we may have or the air conditioning needs that we may have in the future. So, you know, there is an awful lot to be said for remembering that city is also part of nature. The city is also part of the landscape. Back to Jonathan's trade question. And I wish that there was an easy answer to this one. What I do know, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, is that this has become a major question over the last short while with the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which caused great diplomatic kerfuffle. But now we're increasingly seeing a number of trading blocs, including the United States, the UK itself, and others, who are similarly trying to think about what adjustments they need to make in terms of trade for the embedded carbon in the things that are imported. It's absolutely essential that we think this through. I don't know whether carbon border adjustment mechanisms are the right mechanisms or not. But again, and I think this is probably why Jonathan's framed his question in terms of agriculture rather than just any import-export. With agriculture, it gets much, much more complicated, much more difficult to be clear about what the embedded carbon is, as opposed to a ton of steel or something that you bring in. There is no doubt that the European Union's difficulty with getting its agreement with the South American countries of Mercosur ratified has had an awful lot to do with its failure, I use the word advisedly, to really think through the greenhouse gas implications of that deal, and the greenhouse gas implications, particularly around agriculture in that deal. We've also seen it in the UK-Australia deal. Serious work is needed on this, and we really need to talk to colleagues in trade departments to think how to handle this.
Great, thank you, Ronan. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to just bring in a couple of other questions that we've received. So Julia Hinton has asked, is deep sea lithium mining a solution to mineral shortages for EV batteries, or are manufacturers right to reject this practice from their supply chains? I've actually got three questions, so I've got another one that's come through. So that's the first question. The second is from Lauren Eagles, who asks, what are the tangible benefits of rewilding animals here in the UK? Is it a key part of nature restoration or science turned Jurassic Park? And then a third question from Jim Prestige, who asks, models for achieving net zero tend to rely on technology that is either embryonic or as yet non-existent. If the technology fails, will nature-based solutions be able to compensate? So three quite different questions there. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to address one or as many as they like of those questions. And then I think this session will come to an end because we are nearing 5:30. So perhaps, Tawny, I can start with you if you want to address one of those questions and give your sort of concluding remarks.
Yes, thanks. Let me give you an example of on the final question you addressed to us about nature-based solutions and technology. If we look at feeding a growing population, and now I'm looking at Africa, or the African countries, I would say, we have started a project, our organization, Stockholm International Water Institute, to look into how to transform investments in African rainfed agriculture. We know that agriculture requires a lot of energy and water on a daily basis around the world are mainly used for agriculture production. Now, in Africa, we cannot large-scale irrigate Africa, to put it simply, as we did in the Green Revolution in Asia. We need to do it farm by farm, small farmers, but there is a massive investment in total, and that is low-cost technology, also traditional technology, to have rainwater harvesting. But if you do it with 100 millions of farmers at the same time, you do it for good for feeding a growing population, but also it's good for the climate. Because if investments in larger scale, which we have had experience from other areas where, for instance, in India, 25% of energy on a daily basis is used for pumping water from the groundwater to fields. So I think we have a win-win situation here. But our system right now is based more on large-scale finance measures rather to go to this low-scale low technology-based culture. So I think this is a good combination of nature-based solution, kind of. You make it possible for farmers, but you need also some access to finance. So I think that is one part, one example. I have others, but maybe I should also give the floor to other colleagues. We do a lot of source to sea, moving from upstream to downstream to bring about landscape activities that ends up in the sea. But this, I think, is one part that we are working on, like this rainfed agriculture investments in Africa.
Great, thank you. No, that's good to hear. Right, Christine.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on the one that touched on nature-based solutions. I don't can't completely answer the question about whether it can compensate enough. I would just say we can't get enough of it, is I guess how I would conclude. And we need to just get those policy and regulatory frameworks now, because we need to get them right now, because we have a great opportunity. We have reform underway of the water industry natural environment programme, and we need that. We now need that to go as far as possible to supporting those nature-based solutions. And just narrowly looking at the UK, we have this great opportunity with the strategic policy statement that comes out from DEFRA. And we need that to, well, it's a great opportunity to direct the regulators to support the really ambitious reforms we need that will help us deliver everything we've talked about today. So that's what we would like to see.
Great, good stuff. Thank you, Tom.
I'm just going to comment on about deep sea mining for lithium. I think we're only at the beginning of looking at other sources of lithium, and I would hope that the combination of sort of Cornish lithium and taking lithium from that's already in solution. I know that British Lithium are looking at lithium rock, but I would have thought that there will be technological solutions, I'm afraid, for lithium extraction. And I know some of them around forward osmosis and other technologies, which means I would hope that we wouldn't need to do that.
Great, thank you. Mike.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll pick up the last question. I mean, I have no doubt at all that the path that we do follow to get to net zero will differ from the path that we've set out at the Climate Committee and that the government in the UK has set out for the UK. And that tells you that you do have to be planning for, well, when something goes wrong, what is it that picks up the slack? So I think it's an excellent question. I think we should be clear that a lot of the technologies we're talking about are absolutely established, well understood technologies: renewable energy, electric vehicles, heat pumps, insulation, trees. These are not things that are kind of mystic ideas. As you get to the margins, you get more into hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, things that are maybe a bit newer, but again are things that we prove that we can do. And at the absolute margin, you get into things like maybe direct air capture and storage. That's about 1% of the abatement in the Climate Committee scenario. So we are talking about kind of marginal issues in terms of the technologies. I think that's important to recognise. And I think the big challenge with nature is the timescales, actually, in terms of whether it can be the one to pick up the slack. You can't plant a load of trees in 2049 and expect that to deal with your emissions problem if technology hasn't come through. So we need to be developing multiple technology options for various pathways, as well as at the same time moving on nature early and making progress over the next decade. As Christine has said, this is the critical decade. We need to be deploying solutions and developing options as quick as we can.
Yeah, very important point on timing. Ronan.
Well, I think I would close with that thought again, picking up on that question on the unknown technology solutions. As Mike says, there's plenty of known stuff that we can deal with, but I think I would relate it back to my urgency point. And increasingly, I'm noticing in the climate debate that there's a splitting of the ways between those who feel governments will never act, therefore our only solution is technology, and private sector technology in particular. The poster child for this is, of course, Bill Gates's book of earlier this year. And Gates are putting a lot of money into technologies that would address some of these questions, from direct air capture to pretty well everything else. On the other hand, there are solutions that are available to us, but my worry is that, as I said earlier, we're not grasping them with urgency, and that we do have a model that somehow you can just spend and get an instant return. We do not have the kind of patient capital that can sit and watch trees growing for a long period of time. I fear we are about to invent the immediately growing tree. and we will plant the immediately growing tree in 2049. It will be enormous, and it will absorb all of the CO2 in the atmosphere. And the one piece of technology I simply don't believe we will invent is the immediately growing tree. So if we don't start planting some of the slow growing trees that we're also used to, we might get stuck. So I don't want a lot of technology to displace action on things that are already working.
Yeah.
Great. And then final thoughts from you, Tony. Your fellow panelists have left the rewilding animals question to you.
Yes.
I think you are the most suitable to answer it.
Thank you. I'll have a go at that. Thanks ever so much, Ryan. So just a few quick thoughts. So on lithium, we're going to have to get a lot of minerals out of the environment. As we switch from fossil minerals, we're going to need to go to different minerals to be able to meet the demands that are coming. And one thing that we have to bear in mind is not only the sources of all of that, but also to be thinking about the circular economy that can make the most of these minerals. And so recapturing the kinds of materials that are going to be needed for future rounds of consumption. And I read a really encouraging piece the other day in Nature about the extent to which lithium can be reclaimed from used batteries to be able to create new batteries. And this is something that I think now needs to be built into the design cycle for electric vehicles and everything else to ensure that we can get all of these minerals back without having to rely only on mining in the future. And to be applying that to copper and other materials as well. So this is going to be a vital part of where we go, not only renewable, but also circular. When it comes to, the extent to which those kinds of technologies are going to be able to cope with the transition needed and, the extent to which they fail, then leading to a reliance on nature. Well, the simple point, I think, is that there's not enough nature to clean up the mess we're creating. It simply isn't big enough. We're overwhelming natural systems' ability to cope. And so, we can't rely on it, but also at the same time to recognize that the recovery of the natural world is a no regrets option on pretty much every level. We're going to need to blend it into how we use land for other purposes, for food production and everything else. But pretty much everything we'd want to do for nature, it's good for the climate. It's not necessarily true the other way around in terms of whatever we need to do to decarbonize is good for nature. And so, what we do for nature, it will bring multiple benefits, and some of them are to do with climate change mitigation and adaptation. And when we come to the restoration of nature, this is about the recovery of ecosystems, right? And so a lot of what the carbon agenda implies is just putting as many trees in the ground as possible. And, that being nature recovery, that's not it. It's about recovering ecosystems, and recovering ecosystems is about putting all the component parts back. And that includes releasing animals that are now extinct in certain geographies. And in this part of the world, big grazing animals have a massively beneficial effect on biodiversity and can add to the climate change benefits of ecosystem recovery. And animals that are ecosystem engineers, like beavers, putting them back into the environment brings a wide range of upsides, and some of them linked to carbon being caught in beaver meadows, as well as the cleaning up of rivers and reducing flood risk. And then animals that are apex predators that are now absent, putting them back has cascades of effects through the ecosystem that are also beneficial at multiple levels, including sometimes even for carbon. So it's not about recreating an outdoor zoo, putting things back that are quite nice to look at. This is about ecological recovery in ways that are about the whole system. And so, if we do that in a good way, it will have upsides for climate and for everything else. Yeah.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you everyone who's watching this session, whether you're at COP26 or wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us. And, just reflecting on some of Ronan's pessimism, let's hope that there's some more progress in the negotiations. Well, I've heard that some staff have been in Glasgow have been told that they may have to stay a few more days. So let's hope that we get some more breakthrough in the next few days. just to say about Bright Blue, if you've enjoyed this session, please check out our website, consider becoming a member. We're not just a think tank which does interesting, informative, impactful research, but we're also a community of like-minded people. And if you're interested in joining, you can see more details on our website. I want to thank Water UK for partnering with us on this event. And I want to thank the speakers, all of you, for offering your time and your thoughts. We're very grateful for that. So a big virtual round of applause for you, and have a good evening, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.